Good evening, everyone. I hope that you can see and hear us. You're very welcome to say on the chat if everything is all right. We would really appreciate that. Maybe I should start with Alan first. Alan, can you see and hear me? Alan, can you see and hear me? You can just nod. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so I think we are about to start. And tonight it is about leadership and nature. Leadership is about finding your own way, to put it simply, right? And tonight we are going to discuss how nature or nature restoring can help us in finding a true potential. And for this purpose, we have invited the award-winning ecologist, Alan Watson Featherstone. But before, I would like to introduce you to the agenda. So I will briefly present my leadership training platform and introduce myself. Then we will have the presentation from Alan, followed by some small discussion, Q&A session, and the end. So maximum duration is 1.5 hours, but of course, we can always shorten it if we have not so many questions. It all depends on us. But we really invite you to be active and interactive. And for example, say on the chat where you're from, why you're here. It would be very nice. Okay, so starting. My name is Giedre, Grizaite, and I'm originally from Lithuania, but I lived abroad for almost 11 years, 10 years in Denmark and 1 year in Belgium. Out of these cultural experiences, and I also worked with European projects, funding, and as a project consultant in the bank, I could see that leadership and leaders can bring really huge impact on people. And that was very fascinating for me. But on the other hand, I saw that people somehow consider leaders as highly exclusive, especially if they have the title as director, CEO, head of department. And I never understood that. Because I think leadership is for everyone. And this is my main motivator why I created this platform. So we can spread this awareness that leadership is for you and me and everyone else in the world. And we do that through events, and one of them we have for tonight. So now, I guess it's about time to introduce our special guest. And Alan will be talking or sharing his story, how he found his way and heartfelt purpose. That is very much related to Caledonian Forest in Scotland. And this heartfelt journey led to establish the leading charity in Scotland called for Trees for Life. So Alan will be sharing his story and principles, how he actually started and what he has become as he is now. An inspirational TEDx speaker, a very well-known photographer, really high skilled ecologist, and of course, inspirator for all of us. So with my greatest pleasure, I would like to invite Alan Watson Featherstone on the virtual platform. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to pull up the slides. Okay, thank you very much, Giedre, for the introduction and for inviting me to give this webinar. And hi to everybody out there. I'm hoping that this is going to work without any problems. We've had a few hiccups during our rehearsals and practices, so trusting that positive energy is going to flow. So the title that we came up with, Lessons from Nature, how can we heal and start living from our hearts? And for me, that really goes to the essence of what this quality of leadership is. It's about living from our hearts and liberating the power and passion that is inside each of our hearts. And what I want to do this evening is share a bit of my own experience of that, how it's happened for me personally, and what that's led to in my life. So let me just see if I can get this to move on okay. So I want to start with some things that probably everybody on this call knows already, but I think it's important just to acknowledge the state of the planet today. Here's our home, and we live on a wounded, depleted planet. I've had this picture on my wall for nearly 3 decades now, and the most obvious feature on it is the red areas, the desertified land. And most of that land was not originally red in colour, it was much more abundant and fertile. The top of the picture, 2,000 years ago, North Africa was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. So we live on a depleted planet. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event with over 1 million species at risk. Climate change, in everybody's awareness from the recent COP26 event, threatens the survival of many ecosystems and indeed whole countries and civilization itself. And we live in a political and economic system that's in complete thrall to the outdated, insane philosophy of endless growth on a finite planet. And most people in the world today are disconnected from wild nature. So that's kind of the starting point. And many of us perhaps have been aware of this for quite a while. I've certainly been aware of it for most of my adult life. And here's just a couple of scenes that show this in practical reality. Photograph on the left I took in Morocco about 12 years ago. There used to be big forests there. The Atlas cedar is now an endangered species, and you can see there's one standing tree there and the stumps of felled trees and just the desert beyond. And very close to my own home, about 400 meters away, this is a seal washed up on our local beach. Its flippers tangled in rope. It must have drowned from that. So these are symbolic of what's happening all over the planet. I'm just taking to allow a little bit of time lag for this presentation to move forward here to the next slide. There we go. Yeah, so and most people, as I said, live disconnected from wild nature. Urbanization has taken over large tracts of the planet, and the majority of the world's population now lives in environments like this, where there's very little, if anything, of wild nature left. There's very few opportunities for people to connect with it. I'm just still getting the hang of the timing of this. Sorry for the short delays here till we get the slides moving forward. Here we go. So Yeah, what we've lost is the wisdom that indigenous people still live by. And that's been on display at COP26 in Glasgow recently too. Those people, the shrinking numbers of people who still maintain true to their traditions going back thousands of years. This quote attributed to Chief Seattle: "This we know, all things are connected, like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." And of course, we've severed the strands in the web of life by destroying ecosystems, driving species to extinction, and we've severed the strands that link us. So if we want to get the first lesson from nature and about healing, is we have to heal our broken relationship with the rest of nature. We have to reconnect. We have to reestablish a meaningful personal connection with wild nature again. Oh, I'm just waiting for this to find the timing. Is a bit of a mystery to me why it changes sometimes and it doesn't other times. Here we go. So yes, for me, I think my own journey began very much with connecting deeply with nature. I've been very fortunate in my life to spend a lot of time in beautiful parts of the planet. And particularly in my early 20s, I traveled extensively in both North and South America, and I've been to most other continents of the world as well. And I felt deeply nourished by being in these beautiful, wonderful places where nature was still relatively unaffected by people. And this quote from John Muir 120 years ago is even more relevant today. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, and that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of lumber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains of life. And here is a young couple hugging a 1,000-year-old tree in the Araucaria forest, the monkey puzzle tree forest of Chile, which I've visited a few times in recent years. So I think many people in their hearts are realizing they need to reconnect with nature. And I've made that an important part of my life over most of my adult years. And I don't have photographs from all that time, but this is just a few examples. So tropical rainforest in Mexico 20 years ago. Middle picture, I was actually sick with the flu when that was taken. And I got refreshed and revitalized by going into this mountain waterfall when I was in Madagascar. And then a photograph from just a few months ago, again about 3 or 4 miles from my home here on our beautiful Murray coastline. And that's how I maintain my inner connection with spirit. That's how I nourish myself and keep myself as part of the web of life. Maintain that in my daily practice and experience. And I think it's really important. And many people are beginning to discover this now. And during the course of this time, I have to say I've fallen in love with this world. And this is a quote from John Burroughs, an American, and I had it on the door of my room for many years. When I lived in Cluny Hill College in the Findhorn Foundation for 11 years, I had this on my door. I'm in love with this world. I have nestled lovingly in it. I have climbed its mountains, roamed its forests, sailed its waters, crossed its deserts, felt the sting of its frosts, the oppression of its heat, the drench of its rains, fury of its winds, and always have beauty and joy waited upon my goings and comings. I am in love with this world. It is a remarkable place. And this other quote I just want to share with you as well at the moment, because I think this is even more important, from a man called Steve Van Matra. The earth speaks. Yes, the earth speaks, but only to those who can hear with their hearts. It speaks in 1,000 small ways, but like our lovers and families and friends, it often sends its messages without words. For you see, the earth speaks in the language of love. Its voice is in the shape of a new leaf, the feel of a water-worn stone, the color of evening sky, the smell of summer rain, sound of the night wind. The earth's whispers are everywhere, but only those who have slept with it respond readily to its call. So the earth speaks to everyone, and the earth speaks to me through this picture. this picture I showed earlier of this wounded planet. And I became aware many years ago that this is the Earth's voice. This is the call for help, this image in which the most visible areas are degraded landscapes. North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Madagascar, and if you look closely, Antarctica is visible at the bottom as well. So the Earth speaks to me, and I felt called and motivated to respond to that, to act. And that was, very much for me here in Scotland with the local environment. I grew up here and travelled abroad and saw untouched nature, and I realised something was missing and something needed to be done. So what then can one person do to make a difference? There's 7.9 billion of us on the planet now. How can a single individual affect any meaningful positive change? Well, I pondered that question for a while, and it was what drove me to travel abroad for 3.5 years. And I didn't find the answer until I came back to Scotland. And when I came to Findhorn to do a course here in 1978, I was confronted by this question that somebody had pinned up on a wall from the Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If you wanted to put the world to rights, who should you begin with, yourself or others? And up till then, I'd always been thinking it's others. It's the fault of those greedy corporations or corrupt politicians, or, they need to change. But what I was faced with was actually, am I leading a life from my heart? Am I living my own values? Am I doing what I can to put my love for the earth and for nature into practice? So I felt called by this depleted landscape we have in the Highlands of Scotland. Most of our forest is gone. Most of our large wildlife species are extinct. The people who lived in much of the Highlands were evicted 250 years ago. Many of them went to Canada, to Nova Scotia or New Zealand. And we are left with this ruined, wasted landscape, which you can see in these photographs here. And I felt called by these scenes to do something. This is my local version of the Earth's call for help. And in 1986, I organised a big conference here at Findhorn, where I live, called One Earth, a Call to Action. And it was based on the premise that we know what the problems of the world are. It was the year of Chernobyl, 1986, so the environment was up in everybody's awareness. We also know what the solutions are. We know how to get our energy from the sun and the wind. We know how to grow food organically, but nothing's being done about it. Vested interests and institutions keep things the way they are, and change wasn't happening. So our event was designed to address that. And in the final session, we asked people to stand up and make a commitment to do something for the planet. So my commitment was to launch a project to restore this forest in the Highlands of Scotland. And I did that having nothing at all at my disposal to help me achieve a very ambitious goal. I had no resources, I had no training, I had no experience in ecology or forests. I had no access to land. On a practical level, I had nothing to help recover those landscapes that we've just seen in the previous photographs to this. This is one of the best remnants of the forest that still survives today in Glenafric. This is what most of Scotland would have looked like 2,000 years ago, full of wildlife as well. I felt motivated by being in these beautiful places, but by seeing also that they were dying out, just as I'd seen those dying trees in Morocco and elsewhere. The same thing is happening in Scotland. And we've created such an imbalance in the landscape. We have removed all our predators. Wolves, bears, and lynx are long gone. Deer numbers have increased in numbers dramatically, and they're forest animals, so they go into the woodland remnants and they eat any young trees that germinate, as you see in this middle photograph here. And after 200 years of that, we've been left with what I call the geriatric forest. The old trees in the right-hand photograph dying on their feet of old age and not being replaced. There's nothing wrong with dying trees. Everything dies. But what is wrong is there's no birth. There's no new life in this landscape. That was the problem I saw. And for a couple of years, I've been thinking, somebody needs to do something about this. Why isn't the Forestry Commission doing it? That's their job, to grow trees. Or the Nature Conservancy Council, they're supposed to protect nature in Scotland. Nobody was doing anything about it. And I felt, well, I see it, maybe it's me. Maybe this is the earth calling out to me. So that was my commitment to act on that in 1986. And as I said, I had no experience, I had no skills or resources. It took me 3 years to educate myself, to make contact with landowners, to raise money, help to address this sort of problem here. This is the dramatic results of overgrazing in Scotland. This is a particular little clump of rowans, or rowans, people would say in other parts of Britain. On the top left photograph, photographed in 1992, and you can see all through the succeeding years, I go out there about every 5 years, they've not been able to make any net growth because of the extreme browsing pressure from the deer. And you'll see in the background, there's no mature trees, there's no living forest left. Everything is held at the minimum level by this intensive browsing pressure from large numbers of deer. The red deer population has doubled in Scotland in the past 30 or 40 years. And with no predators to keep them under control, to move them on, they just browse everything to death. So the trees and the wildlife are gone, so too are the people. And many landscapes are like this picture on the left here. These are what we call peat hags. This is a tree cemetery. It's a forest graveyard. Those stumps, some cases are maybe a few decades old. In some cases, they can be several thousand years old, but they show that this land was formerly covered in forest. And the right-hand photograph, you can see there, those big blocks on the gravel bar there are lumps of peat that have been eroded away because there's no trees to hold them in place anymore, washed downstream. And in the background, you can see the ruins of a croft, a small house where somebody lived, probably 200 years ago. There'd be somebody living there. No possibility for any to live there today because there's nothing on that land that could support people anymore. It's just been left at the bare minimum. So by learning to connect deeply with nature, I felt that the land and the trees were calling for help. And I felt that I could do something. I could make a difference. I felt like I can give my care and my love, my passion, and do something to make a difference. So after a number of years, I raised a bit of money. I'd made contact with landowners. The first work taking place in 1989 was protecting a few trees with tubes just to keep them safe from deer. But in 1990, the big breakthrough came when I made an arrangement with the Forestry Commission to protect 50 hectares, 125 acres of land with a fence. And that went up in September 1990. And the photograph on the left here, that was taken almost 2 years later in 1992. And you can see the fence, and you can see a tree already beginning to grow above the surrounding vegetation because it hadn't been eaten by deer for 2 years by that stage. Photograph on the right is the same tree taken 2 months ago in September this year on the 30th anniversary of the fence going, the 31st anniversary of the fence going up. So I just want to say as a little aside here, if you look at the picture of me in 1990, I was very much a hippie looking character. I had a full head of log hair in those days, and my beard was a bit bigger and thicker than it is today. And I had no track record in forestry. I had no official standing, so it's a bit of a miracle that the Forestry Commission, the professionals who owned this land, agreed to work with me. They had land and they could see the forest was dying, but they had no money at the time because of government budget cuts. I had raised enough money, but no land to put a fence up on. So we came together as very unlikely partners. But that was the critical turning point, because from up till then, for 3 or 4 years, I'd had this idea. I'd made a commitment, but there was nothing practical to see from it. But when that fence went up and the trees were free to grow, the vision started to take form. And the process of the love from my heart and the care from my heart became manifest, and nature began to recover through the joint effort with the Forestry Commission. And that's crucial in any project, because it's when it actually becomes manifest, it takes physical form, that it becomes like a living thing itself. And like a seed, it needs nourishment to grow. And that's what happens when an idea crosses that threshold from just being an idea into being something in practical action. That's really crucial, because that's what's lacking so much in the world today. So here's a couple of other pictures from that same area. And this to me is even more important and dramatic. The one on the left was taken before the fence went up in 1989, and it's very visually demonstrating the dying forest. Living trees in the distance, 3 snags or standing dead trees in the foreground. These are Scots pines. They die of old age. and the resin in the trunks keeps the trunks preserved for a long time. If you look at the photograph on the right, taken last month actually, you can see I'm standing next to the middle tree from the left photograph, and it's virtually unchanged in the 32 years between those two images. But what you see on the right, of course, is all the young trees. Nobody planted those, they grew by themselves. The seeds that were occurring naturally from the trees in the background, once they stopped getting eaten, they could grow, and you can see they're growing at varying rates. So it's not like a plantation, it's a natural forest. So natural regeneration is the best way to do this. Let nature do most of the work. Nature knows best where trees should be. The seeds will grow by themselves. But that only works if you've got a seed source. So we also started planting trees in 1991 in areas where there were no seed sources nearby. So we wanted to accelerate the return of the forest. It would eventually recover, but it might take decades or centuries for the trees to colonize, because Scots pine seeds travel on average something like 50 or 100 meters from a parent tree. So we've got kilometers and kilometers of empty land in Scotland with no trees nearby. So we planted trees to create seed sources for the future. On the left here, you see a volunteer, April 1991, next to the stump of an old pine. So we knew it was a good place to plant a tree, and he's holding his tree up. And the photograph on the right, that's the tree he planted. And if you look just to the right of the base of the trunk, you can just about make out part of the stump, which is still there. But what's very dramatic is the stump has been covered by heather and grass and plants, because all of that was suppressed before in the photograph on the left due to deer pressure. So when you put up a fence, plant some trees, the trees grow, but all the other vegetation comes back because it's liberated from the restraint that's imposed by heavy grazing pressure from so many deer. Here's a very dramatic example of that along the edge of a fence of the same area from the last photograph. So these are some of the trees that were planted in 1991. This is taken, I think, 23 years later. And you can see the pines have grown. There's heather flowering, and the green bush on the bottom left is bog myrtle, which is an aromatic shrub which has bacterial nodules in its roots. It grows in boggy ground, and the bacteria fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, so it actually fertilizes the soil and prepares the way for trees to follow. And if you look outside the fence, you can see again the peat hags and just the grass, and nothing else can grow there. So it's actually very simple. Nature really responds when we remove this imbalance of far too much browsing pressure that we have in Scotland. So that's where this already started. This is going back 30 years now. The project has grown and developed substantially since then. And over time, even things like the peat hags recover. Here on the left, another example of the peat hags, just the barren landscape, the tree cemetery. And on the right, you can just about see the fence in the top right of the photograph there that protects this area. And you can see the stump in the middle has become overgrown with heather that's in flower. The bright red underneath is sphagnum moss. And you can see life is beginning to recover here after 20 years. It's a slow process, but even these peat hags are open, gaping wounds in the land. They should not be there. So nature has this tremendous healing ability, and we prevent it in Scotland, as we do in so many parts of the world. So if we stop preventing it and we can actually assist it, we can perhaps accelerate it. That's the work of a healer, to accelerate a person's natural healing ability. So I think of myself sometimes as helping with this healing process of the earth. And it's a learning experience, you know. When this started for me, nobody was doing much like this at all. It was a new thing. Nowadays, there's a lot of people involved in rewilding. It's really exciting to see. And because these sites are over 30 years now of new growth, I've been able to document the recovery. So as soon as trees and other vegetation grow, insects appear. They fly in because they've got a food source. They breed and they pollinate, and they provide a food source for birds. And you begin to see the whole web of life recover from the simple act of helping the vegetation, the foundation of the ecosystem, to grow in natural abundance once again. It's a very heartening process. It's very fulfilling. It's deeply touching for me to see this, because it's actually so simple. And these areas, you know, the Scots pines I planted could potentially live for 500 years. So that's a gift to the future. So the charity I founded, Trees for Life, grew and developed. I'm not part of it anymore. It's 4 years since I left, but it's still going strong. And in 2008, we raised £1.65 million to buy 10,000 acres of land. Up till then, we'd always worked on other landowners' land. So when we worked on our own, we weren't constrained by differing agendas or different objectives. And remember, I started this charity with nothing. All I had was my passion, my inspiration. But by applying myself in 2008, it was already 22 years since I'd made the commitment, able to raise 1.65 million. People respond to positivity, and when they see something happening that is liberating the power of the heart, that is allowing love for the earth and care for the earth to be expressed, people want to support that, because everybody knows the planet's heading in the wrong direction at the moment. And whenever somebody does something positive, it's like, yes, you know, let's cheer them on, let's help them, let's support them. So it's infectious in a very positive way. And that's what I've experienced. And Trees for Life has a large supporter base now and has influenced many other organizations. And crucially also, it's influenced the thousands of people who've come to volunteer. We started a volunteer program in 1991, so that's 30 years ago, and thousands of people have taken part in that, many coming back year after year. We've trained people up to lead the volunteer programs, and they've gone on to set up projects of their own sometimes. And everybody goes away really touched and inspired by doing something, because they know they've given something back to the planet. So many people, I think, come back to this question: what can one person do to make a difference? So if you come and plant a tree that could be there for 500 years, that's a big difference. Think of the squirrels and the birds, the insects, the plants, the lichens that will benefit from that tree, and all the people in the future who will appreciate it too. So it's often creates life-changing experiences for people. So that's a very brief synopsis and summary. There's much more information about Trees for Life on the website and in some other talks I've done before. There's a TEDx talk I gave a few years ago. If you haven't seen that, I'd encourage you to look at it, where I go into this in more detail. But really, that was just an example, because what I want to talk about more is the process by which this happened in the last part of the webinar. So there's a revitalised forest as a legacy for the future. But how did this all come about? Well, here at Findhorn, Eileen Caddy, one of the founders, often referred to what she called the 3 Ps: patience, persistence, and perseverance. And she was a great person for thinking about the positive. And she said, you have to have patience, persistence, and perseverance to hold true to your vision, to act on it unwaveringly, and to keep going. And those have been one of my guidelines for many years. But over the course of doing this work, I've come up with another 3 Ps for myself: passion, purpose, and power. Because this came about because I felt passionate about the forest and the dying forest, and I felt I needed to do something about it. Nobody else was doing anything at the time. I felt the call. So I made it my purpose. And by doing that and saying, I love this landscape, I love these old trees, I need to help them, I found my power to make a difference. And that's the key to it: listening to the passion of my heart and aligning that with purpose and accessing the power that is there. And that has given me a voice. I used to be very shy, and I can now speak in an impassioned way because I've opened the doors to my heart and I let that come out, and I get a lot of feedback about that. So that's a skill I never knew I had until I actually took the risk of following my heart and doing something. So there's 3 steps for me to this process of living our power, living from the heart. One is clarity of vision. What is it that I really believe in? What is it that really speaks to my heart? And then making a commitment to that. That's what I did in 1986 when I said I commit myself to launch a project to restore this forest in Scotland. But the commitment alone is not enough. It then has to be translated crucially into practical action. And that's often where things fall short. And we've seen examples of that just in this past week with COP26, you know, where they've come out with various pledges, but there's been very little specifics about practical action. Of course, that's where governments and countries have been falling down for many, many years. And it's clear to me, as I think it is to many people, that governments are not going to produce the answers to this. It's actually individuals, it's the grassroots, it's the people who are connecting again with the land and with each other, who are creating a new way or a renewed way of living in harmony and balance with the earth, that are actually going to turn things around. So these three things then, they liberate the energy of the heart and begin the process of manifestation, the process of actually transforming a vision and putting it into practice. So an idea or a project or a vision is like a seed. It needs to be fed in order to grow. And for me, my idea, my project got fed by following up every thought or lead. Every time somebody asked me about it, I would talk about it. I got invited to write magazine articles. I started to get invited to give talks. I began doing that. And every time I spoke, I felt the project begin to grow in me, and I got new ideas coming. And the seed was germinating and growing inside myself. That's the only way I can describe it. So bring all the talents and skills I have to it. So my photography, that's been a great tool for me. That's one creative talent I have. Other people, it might be poetry or craft work or something else. But for me, photography, I'm a very visual person. And then it's also about alignment and coherence of vision and action. It's not saying one thing and doing something different. It's actually about having action that's aligned with the vision. And then at the bottom, I say, don't be discouraged when obstacles appear. Obstacles always appear, unfailingly. And that's when the commitment is really tested. It's easy to be committed when people are coming and say, oh, that's a great idea, Alan. Here's £5, or why don't you write an article for my magazine? It's great. But it's when the obstacles and blocks appear. And that came up for me in many ways in the early days. People said, well, you are part of a charity, the Findhorn Foundation, and if you put a fence up on somebody else's land, it becomes their property, and charities can't be allowed to benefit private individuals. I had to get legal advice on that, and the charity trust deed had to be amended. It took a year. I could have given up. I could have said, well, nice idea. But I had to be committed and true to commitment, and we found a way forward and made it work. So whatever you're doing, whatever your passion is, whatever your project is, don't get discouraged. When obstacles appear, that's the time to go back to the heart and reconnect and say, is this still what calls me? Is this still my true path? And if the answer is yes, there's always a way forward in my experience. So those are some of the things I've learned. But for me, it's not just about the work I do in the project for the forest. It's actually about my whole life. And I've taken time over the past 40 years to try and bring my daily experience into alignment with my life values as much as possible. And I'm not there yet. I've still got a ways to go. But these are just a few examples. And because I traveled in South America in the early 1970s and seen the destruction of the Amazon and Central American rainforests for cattle pasture, I knew what was going on. So I became vegan in 1979. Most of my life I've been vegan because I discovered that a vegan diet needs 10% of the land area to support it that a meat-based one does. And that's a way I could act, free up land for forests to flourish and wildlife. Been living at Findhorn, an eco-village, since 1978. My house, low energy, insulated, highly insulated. We have an on-site living machine sewage treatment. Our electricity comes from our community wind farm. You see in the photos there, that's taken out of my bedroom window, looking at them. Don't need a car to get out to places like Glenafric, so there's no public transport there. So we have a small electric car, which we bought secondhand. We grow organic vegetables. I grow sprouts in my kitchen. Every day I have fresh sprouts that have been nurtured by my own love. All our food shopping's done in our community shop. Most of my clothes are secondhand from charity shops. So these are a few of the ways that I've worked to bring my daily life into alignment with my values of care for the earth, love for nature, love for the planet. And there's lots more to do. I'm not perfect by any means. It's an ongoing process. But these are the sorts of steps that increase my power, because every time I make a choice along these lines, I'm saying yes to my vision, yes to my heart, and that gets expressed in another aspect. So I'm just about out of time, I think. I've got just 2 or 3 more slides here waiting for it to change. Here we go. So this is a quote that actually I just found a few days ago. Actually, it was my wife who showed it to me, and it seemed very appropriate for this presentation. This is Luther Standing Bear, an indigenous Native American Oglala Lakota Sioux chief. And when I read this, it really spoke to me. He knew that the heart of a human being became hard when he is not connected to the natural world. He knew that this lack of connection and respect for living things results in the lack of respect for ourselves and our fellow beings. Therefore, he made sure that his children were brought up living with the gentle influence of and in harmony with nature. So that was sometime in the 19th century where he made that statement, but it's as equally true today as it was then. And it made me think about my own son, who's now 26, but I really spent a lot of time in his earlier years bringing him out into wild nature as much as I could. So these are 3 photographs of some of his journey through life. So when he was 3, my then wife and I took him to Australia, and you can see he's seeing a little lizard there somewhere in the Australian outback. Canadian Rockies at age 12, a bit more adventurous, and then locally on Findhorn Beach 5 years ago at age 21. Our children of the future, we need to ensure that there's a livable, viable, abundant and beautiful planet for them to thrive on. That's the calling, I think, for all of us now. We've inherited this depleted planet that I started this presentation with, and the task for this generation and probably several generations to come is restoring the earth. It's actually returning the earth to full abundance, diversity, and vibrant health again. And that's the big picture within which I lead my life and which I do my work. And it's great that we're now living, I don't know if any of you know this, but the United Nations declared on the 5th of June this year that we're now in the decade for ecological restoration. I think we need a century of restoring the earth, but a decade is a good start. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Just see what the last slide is. How it's going very slowly, these changes. Yes, there we are, back to the beginning slide. So I hope that's been useful, and sorry for the occasional halts while the slides changed. So Giedre, I don't know what we do now. Do I stay as a co-host, or how do we work this?